Okay, so this is the Monday class. Is there any questions about the schedule going forward? All right. So the chapter we're going to talk about to start is Civility and Authority by Michael Braddick. I know Timothy and Abby, I don't remember if you're in the Wednesday class or not, but some of you have a leg up on this, so that's bad news for you because now I'm going to pick on you to help move us along. So for the British, social order and political order are linked, according to Braddick, right? And so in order to hold political office and political control, an individual has to be a gentleman, right? Must manifest gentility. This is sort of the concept of the rule by better sorts, right? And so this example of a well-ordered house, a well-ordered farm, excuse me, a well-ordered family, or manifestations about being suited for rule. And there are certain prerequisites to be considered for rule. Timothy, what are they? What's the number one thing you have to be?
Considered for rule, you said?
Yes, in the British concept.
Oh, your social standing.
Right. So what does that mean?
You have to be, it's what you're born into almost. You can't earn your way up to it. It's just.
It's not almost, it is, right? So there is the ruling class, which is by function of birth, right? So you cannot be someone who manifests gentlemanly behavior if you're not a gentleman, right? And so this idea that the better sorts sets the pace for the rest of society is a peculiar British Atlantic world, not peculiar to the British, but it is a feature of this British idea, right? And so I gave an example last week that hopefully you remember, the Stamp Act. How is that supposed to work? If you don't know, that's fine.
It was, it meant that they had to have that particular documentation in order to do any kind of business transaction or.
Okay, good. So how did Parliament want to impose this? How did they figure they could impose this revenue generating tax?
Like how specifically was it imposed?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, so I'm probably going a little too fast for the people who weren't in last Wednesday's class. So the Stamp Act is a piece of parliamentary legislation that is passed in the run-up to the American Revolution. And it's about generating revenue, right? And so the reason I want to talk a little bit about the Stamp Act is because it's a part of the discussion that's part of the film. So I want to set it up for you when you see the film to understand this sort of framework, right? So for the Stamp Act, this is a piece of legislation that to generate money from the colonies, Parliament is requiring that all business and all many pleasure items are things that use paper have to occur on special stamped paper that you have to purchase. So what does that mean? So if you want to post a placard for advertising, you had to use special stamped paper. You bought this paper from someone who represented the British Crown. Some of that revenue goes to the Crown. So it's about generating money. If you're an attorney and you want to file an order in court, you had to use special stamped paper that you had to purchase, generating money. If you sail ships and you have your ship's manifest, the lading, all the things that go into that had to be on stamped paper, which came from Parliament, which included this tax that went back to Parliament, right? So it's a revenue generating thing. So that concept of generating revenue from the colonies, that's what Parliament's trying to achieve here, right? And they're going to use this money to offset the debt that the British have accrued in prosecuting the war, what we call the French and Indian War, and what they call over in Europe the 7 Years' War, right? So that's its intent. That's fine. Its method of getting this tax instituted is a perfect embodiment of this concept, right? So how does Parliament intend to do it? Well, they know that this is going to be unpopular, but they're relying upon the way they view things as working. And the way they view things as working is that those who are the better sorts set the pace for the rest of society to follow. So that's how they're going to install the Stamp Act. They're going to identify in each city or colony or town the leadership, the most prominent members, the gentlemen of the community, and they're going to use them to implement this system. And they say, we're going to identify this person in Boston. He's going to be our local Stamp Act agent. He's going to get all this paper that we're going to ship to him, and then he's going to be responsible for collecting the money from the colonists for it. Now, to make it worthwhile, he gets a little taste, right? So he gets a little bit of this profit, but most of the money goes back to London to help, generate revenue and pay down the debt, right? But the idea is that the local elite will be the one that sets the pace, and everybody else will fall in line, because that's how they see the world operating. The better sorts set the pace, and all the common people fall in line behind them, because that's the way they see things as working, right? Which is why when they view the colonies, they view them as beneath them, because in the eyes of this British ruling class, the colonies are disordered. They're not orderly towns and societies. They're places where if you ask them frankly, they'd say there's not enough of the better sorts here, right? And so what you end up with is what they called mob rule, or the rule by the people who are not fitted to run society, is how they would see it. And as a marker of that, they look at the way the countryside looks. To the British eyes, it looks disordered. And so that sort of conceit that as they would call them, the provincials are always going to be behind, is a reflection of how they see the world. The problem is, so many of these provincials are not the better sorts, right? And so what you have on one aspect is the view from the metropole of the colonies. These folks are always backwards, right? But the other problem is, for the colonists, they're always aspiring to be like the elites back in England, right? And so they too imbibe this notion that, your social status is a manifestation of your fitness for political rule. And so they seek to copy that, right? And so the difference is in the metropole in England, that in London, your position is assured by your birth into that class, right? Now, it doesn't mean necessarily you're going to get political power, but that's the first step. You have to be from the right class, right? And then your ability to model gentlemanlike behavior, gentility, is a sign that you're, fitted for higher political rule, right? But if you're not born into that class, you shall not rule, right? That's just, you're not one of the better sorts and can never aspire to be one, right? So that difference is, it's much more firmly locked in place. There's some movement, but very little. In the colonies, it's much more fluid. There's a lot more movement. And so you end up with someone like King Carter, as he was called. King Carter amasses a fortune running a plantation in Virginia, and becomes a gentleman in Virginia, right? And he has a mansion, and it's well stocked, and he puts on these elaborate dinners that are very formal. He dresses in finery and drives a a coach with this really sharp team of horses and has this appearance of being a gentleman. And he adopts this gentleman-like persona as part of it, to elevate himself as someone who should be fitted to rule, right? But the thing is, King Carter came as an indentured servant. He's not from the right class, but he rose in the colonies. In the colonies, you can rise because it's much more fluid. There's not many of the better sorts here, as it's seen, and your opportunity it is much more. It's the movement between the classes. It's a much more flat in the English society component. It's a much more flat society, so people can raise themselves up. It's King Carter's sons and grandsons that start really embodying these pretensions that they're born to rule. King Carter knows that he's not born to rule. He came as an indentured servant, right? But he also knows that the appearance of being in the right class is also a component of rule, right? And so he seeks to actively manifest that. So that's why the Stamp Act is such a nice illustration of this, right? It's this idea that for the Parliament, this is how they see the world. Of course, the common people will follow the local gentlemen in Boston and New York and Charleston because that's how things work. The better sorts are the ones that the common people look up to and recognize their fitness for rule, right? So here in the colonies, things don't work that way, or not as efficiently, right? And that's also, I should also point out, some folks have been doing some work on frontiers, right? So women on the frontier, gender roles on the frontier. The frontiers are places where things are much more fluid, right? Because on the frontier, you're not part of this established system. You're beginning to carve out a system, right? And so in those places, not only is, their social and political rules much more fluid, right? People on the frontier can rise to positions of political power that aren't tied to where they're born, right? Aside from being English, right? Or British. It's also true for genders. On the frontiers, women's roles are much more loosely defined than they are in the more settled areas, and certainly much more loosely defined than the very strict constraints that proper gentle women have in the British Isles. So as you get into the frontier, that social mobility and the fluidity of gender roles is a function of frontier life, right? It's not that same locked into place system that extends from the British Atlantic world and extends to the colonies. Okay, any other questions about, or any questions about civility and authority? I know I went through it pretty quickly. Everyone feels they have a good grip on that? Okay, I want to skip to chapter 9, which is Race by Joyce Chaplin. And this is a concept that when Chaplin wrote this essay or presented this paper, it was maybe a little bit more controversial than it is in the present day. And so I'll give you an example. This concept of race, I think today, in today's society, we understand much more commonly that this is a artificial construct, right? That race is not a biological feature, but is something that is imposed as a type of box, right? And so this idea of race used to be that you are check one box, right? And so you are this or that. Well, I think today there's much more of the realization that, race is not a box that one is fitted into. It is kind of a spectrum, because people don't fit into those little rigid boxes so easily. So when Chaplin's writing this, there was increasing recognition that race is an artificial construct, that it's something that it's described as having hard, fast differences, but that's inaccurate. And I've taken a long way to get around to this point. This will be a point that'll be of great interest to future historians, even greater interest in the historians today. In 1990 was the first census year that people could check more than one box for their race. That prior to 1990, you had to check that you were white or black or Pacific Islander or something, right? That you had to choose which category you fit into, right? But in 1990, there was a realization that people don't fit into those boxes. The bureaucracy is rarely in advance of popular sentiments and movements. And so the reality that the United States Census allowed you to check more than one box tells us something about the way the world is changing. Chaplin's writing her essay in the early 2000s. So this is during a period of movement on this concept, right? And so what Chaplin says is that race matters, but what's important is that we not view the past with the same knowledge that we have today. So when Chaplin's writing her essay about race, there were certain concepts about the way the world worked, right? Taking those concepts when she wrote that essay and projecting them into the past is something that historians call presentism, right? Which is that instead of allowing the past to evaluate these things on their own terms, we're trying to impose the way we understand the world today onto people in the past, which would be unfair, right? Racism, when Chaplin is writing, or race as a concept, was still much more rigid than I would argue we experience today, right? That there's this notion of sort of separation between races is much more concrete when Chaplin's writing than general perceptions of race today. But these ideas are, you can't impose them on the past. And the thing to understand that as Chaplin was writing this is that the racism, as we term it, right? The meaning of the term racism today, it's not an absolute thing that is extended through history. Instead, racism is a creation of the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world created this concept of racism. Now, racism in and of itself has a history, which Chaplin's going to discuss. But to begin with, she says, the reason that we have this idea of racism, of most particularly Black and white populations, in which the white population views the Black population as both a separate entity, Black, as opposed to white, which was seen as a separate entity, but also the idea that Blacks are inferior and are fitted to only certain things is a creation of the Atlantic world that overlaps with what's called modernity. The Atlantic world system that we talked about with Klein and also drew upon some other historians talking about how the plantation system evolved, right? Slavery and modernity overlap in the Atlantic world system. And what started off as slavery is something that was, an equal opportunity offender in history. Lots of different peoples ended up in slavery. In the Atlantic world, increasingly slavery became tied to people from Africa. And because that linkage of this Atlantic world system led to the portrayal of Africans as slaves, it created this concept of racism. For the English, right? So in the British Atlantic world, we're talking about, the perceptions of British people and how they play out in the American colonies, this is something that the British didn't invent, right? The British came to this party late. And so what Chaplin argues is that the English copy the people who had already established colonial relations and plantation economies before, and they pick up these sort of notions that are in circulation, and then they further develop them, right? So the English adopt the views of Africans from their Iberian predecessors, the Spanish and the Portuguese. And they also adapt their view of Native Americans, again, from the Iberians, but also to some degree from the French. So because the British are late to the party, these practices and policies and ways of doing things were already in place, and the English just fitted themselves in it, right? They didn't create it out of whole cloth. There were models that were being adapted. And so understanding this concept is understanding how racism as an idea, or the portrayal of separate races on a hierarchical view, becomes part of this world, right? It is strange to say that something that is still a prominent part of society today, this concept of race is of fairly recent determination. This is not to suggest that there weren't visions of people's status being inferior, but that status of inferiority was not tied to some sort of designation as people of a race, right? So the idea of inferiority was the view of the aristocratic class to their own citizens, right? To look at these people that they rule over and see them as a lesser sort. You're born into the peasant class. Peasants are inferior. That is sort of the tautological answer, right? And so the view of people as inferior was not based upon their physical depictions, as we call race, right? It was based upon what class you were born into. And so they saw this lower class as people who were inferior to them. And because they're from the ruling or aristocratic class, they are born into a higher status. So this trend is between the ruling class and the ruled, right? But there is the development of a concept of racism, and the place to find it is to start with the Iberians, right? And they start with this concept. So here I'm talking specifically about the Spaniards. And so we need a little bit of Spanish history, right? Or at least part of this to think about how this comes to be. So one of the things I suggested last week when we were talking about class, in which I said the Spanish came to the colonies carrying the sword and the cross. So we talked about the cross aspect, the missionary component of the Spanish Empire, which was built around a mission, right? They establish a church and bring the people there to be converted and taught how to live as the Spanish wanted them, right? That process of conversion, it carries with it a notion of superiority, right? And the superiority that they're really thinking about is in terms of religion. The Spanish didn't just invent this idea. This notion of Spanish superiority in religion and Spanish purity in religion is an outgrowth of Spanish history, right? It is a coincidence of time that at the same time Christopher Columbus is sailing out into the Atlantic Ocean, that same year was the year that the Spanish had finally evicted who they called the Moors, which were the Muslim invaders who had captured and occupied Spain for 7 centuries, right? This long process of reconquering the Spanish peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, which is formerly known as the Reconquista, right? Under this harsh regime of evicting these people you considered infidels and invaders, even though they had been there in some cases for 7 centuries, is a process of complete intolerance. There's no acceptance of the Muslim population and their religion, right? That religion needs to be eradicated root and branch. That becomes part of this Reconquista. Along the lines with this Reconquista, eradicating Muslims. And here's sort of the psychology that has to be borne in mind as well. Part of the issue is that there are people who look just like you, because the Moors had been occupying Spain for 7 centuries. Some of those people who have converted to Islam look just like you, the Spanish Reconquista soldiers seeking to evict them. And so emphasizing an intolerance and a purity in the return of this Catholic rule, right, means that the defeated are given the choice. They can be evicted or they can convert. An eviction could come in the form of physical eviction, booting them out of Spain, or evicting them from life on earth, right? And so there's this stunning and widespread intolerance for different religious beliefs, which includes Jews. There are Jews in the Iberian Peninsula as well. And so this conversion process is a process of ripping out these other religious beliefs, preventing people from practicing them. Some of these Jews who converted to Catholicism, there began to be this sort of idea that these conversios were people who weren't, they weren't really dedicated to becoming Catholics, that they converted in name only, right? But in the privacy of their own home, they continued to practice Jewish beliefs. And this was considered intolerant. And so they began to develop this notion that even people who had converted for now a generation or two, they carried within them some sort of seed of Jewishness, which the Spanish referred to as Jewish blood. And so you begin to get the concept that there's something inheritable, the blood, that marks them off as different. And so this, the cauldron of Spanish reconquest carried with it this intolerance of other religions and the developing idea that there are something about different sets of people that can be passed down. This is really kind of the origin of the concept of race, because you're talking about something that's inherited, a characteristic, what the Spanish would call Jewish blood, right? This group of folks with their very intolerant views of other religious practices, right, are the folks who came to the New World. And they began, and they were mixing together, themselves with Native Americans with their variety of distinctive attributes, and bringing into this mix Africans who also had distinctive attributes. And both sets have different religious traditions and beliefs, right? And so this mixing together, in which you have folks of sharply different physical appearance. Native Americans do not look like Spaniards, who do not look like Africans, right? You begin to see the development of this concept of viewing others as attributes of their things that are manifested physically, they would call a race. And then you see the effect of these interactions, right? So when the Spanish arrive, over time, under this colonial structure, Native Americans continue to die, right? And so the Spanish begin to develop this concept of Native Americans as weak, right? That it's some sort of racial component, some sort of characteristic they have that makes them weaker than the Spaniards, right? And so that concept of viewing Native Americans as weak elevates the Spaniards above these Native Americans, even though under the order of the Pope, they're supposed to work to convert their souls. They see Native Americans as a distinct set of folks who are inferior physically to the Spanish. Meanwhile, they're importing Africans to replace the workforce of Native Americans. And they see that in many of these tropical areas, the Africans seem to survive longer, right? And because they're bringing Africans in one role, physical labor, that they're going to compel slavery, right? They see Africans as strong, powerful, right? But because they're slotted into these roles of physical labor on a plantation, they do not see them with any intellectual capacity. So they begin to develop these ideas of Africans as only fitted for the role of strong-backed labor, right? And so you begin to see, as part of this colonial experience, the beginning concepts of racial distinctions, right? Making associations based upon race for Africans, Native Americans, and themselves Spaniards, right? Or if they're in a good mood, Spaniards and Portuguese. This is when the British, the English arrive. When the English arrive, these things are already locked into place. Africans in the New World are labor. That's what they're there for, right? There is no importation of Africans to do anything else except physical labor, right? Harsh physical labor in harsh environments. The Native American populations have the same experience with the English over time that the Spaniards do. The arrival of English, firmer connections, as we see with the Iroquois, eventually lead to the continual decimation of the Native American population. So like the Spaniards, the English adopt the concept of Native Americans as a group that are weak and destined to be replaced, right? So the replacement with what is increasingly seen as the superior folks as they see it, right? And then into this system, you see the British fitting themselves. Native Americans may have some admirable qualities, right? You see a lot of early rhetoric in the propaganda talking about these Native American peoples, but they're always sort of, excuse me, seen as tragic, right? I believe it's the Massachusetts state seal that has a Native American person that says, "Come help us," right? This idea that that's what the Europeans, although they wouldn't call it Europeans, they would call themselves, you know, the English race or the Scottish race, or eventually the British race, as we see the concept that Britain is formed out of this cauldron, right? But this process is something that evolves over time. And I'm going to give you an example. So this concept of Native Americans as a race of people in one sense is situated off, and Africans as a race of people in another fashion situated off. But again, thinking about these English folks coming, they're still carrying within this concept of the differentiation based upon birth, right? Who knows anything about the founding of the Jamestown colony? When I ask that general question, what do you guys know about Jamestown? Danny, what do you know about the founding of the Jamestown colony?
I don't know much about it.
Okay. Who founded it? What set of folks? I'll give you a hint. The book we're reading is about the British Atlantic world.
So the British?
Okay, so they become British, right? So we were discussing in, I believe it was Games's essay, talking about how migration leads to British concepts, or a British identity, I should say, not concepts, right? But it's not first established by what we would call British. They would be English, right? Cynthia, do you know anything about the founding of Jamestown?
Not really, no.
Okay. Okay, so it's actually the name of the colony was, the attempt to gain favor with the Queen of England, the Virgin Queen, as she was known, right? So naming it Virginia was an attempt to curry favor because these were wealthy adventurer investors who had established their colonial experience was in Ireland, was in transforming Ireland into an English colony. And so some of them were looking for opportunities, and they seized upon establishing a colony in North America. And some of these folks came across, and these are, as Braddick would say, the better sorts, the people to the manner born, the gentleman class, right? They're seeking to recreate what they have made work in Ireland in hopes of making greater wealth, right? They're hoping initially that they're going to find gold and silver like the Spaniards. And so they're planning on establishing this colony where you have some of the better sorts who are fitted to rule, but they're going to need labor. And so they have searched about for the common folk who are going to do this labor. And the way this colony was initially structured, what they thought would happen would be they would establish this colony. The native peoples would be so impressed with who they are and what they bring that they would gladly help supply them with food, and that the better sorts in the colony would make the lower sorts go out and dig up the gold and silver that was going to enrich primarily the better sorts, but the common folks would get a little bit of it. So it was something that was seen as a wealth generating operation, right? Well, as it turns out, it didn't work out that way, right? So the common people went out looking for gold and silver and didn't find any. The attempt to install themselves as the superior to the Native American population didn't go well either. And so conflict erupted between the two groups. The people in Jamestown who had constructed a fort to stay safe could rarely leave the fort because the Native American population that surrounded them were none too keen on them, and the Native American population didn't want to bring them food to eat, right? And so that first season, was terrible. People starved to death. And the pattern somewhat recycled every year. New colonists would come across, less and less of the better sorts, although there were a few people to rule the colony, and lots of the common people in desperate circumstances. And each year, either the crops didn't do well or they didn't grow enough crops. And so there was always a starving season where people would suffer, right? And so I'm going to give you an illustration of how order was maintained in the Jamestown colony in a particularly heinous way, right? So during one starving season, the colony had in its storehouse as part of the fort, it had stored up all the food and it was parceling it out very little at a time, and people were desperately hungry. So an individual was caught stealing a pint of oatmeal from the common stores, right? So he's a common person. He's stealing some food so he or his family can eat, not much family, probably himself, right? And so he's trying, to steal food to survive, gets caught. And he received the following punishment. He was chained to a post in the center of the fort, and a long iron pin was driven through his tongue so that he'd be unable to eat. And he starved to death before the entire community because he was there to serve as a lesson to what happens when you try and steal from the storehouse, right? This is a particularly vicious punishment that's inflicted upon an individual who is English, just like you, right? During the period of the Virginia colonies, the colony went bankrupt. Well, in 1614, the colonists, as we discussed previously, finally hit upon something that could be profitable, the growing of tobacco. But unfortunately, it was too late for the colony investors who went bankrupt, and the colony was taken over by the crown. So it became a royal colony. So during the 1600s, the colony now, because it has a successful export product, plantation product tobacco, began to attract more settlers, right? And many of those settlers came as indentured servants. And so they completed their indenturitude, and then they were granted their own property. And increasingly larger percentages of the people who came as indentures survived. And so the colony began to grow. The colonists were growing more and more tobacco. It's a royal colony in which a royal governor is appointed to oversee it, and this rule by the better sorts continues, right? And this royal governor extended favorable relations to family members and other people from the aristocratic class in the following fashion. Every year, you owed to the crown, because it's a crown colony, a portion of the tobacco that you grew as tax. And then the crown would sell that tobacco and keep the revenue, right? So you had to pay your taxes in the form of the tobacco you grew, right? And so everybody had to dedicate a certain amount of their tobacco to fund the colony, right? But the royal governor and some of his inner circle were exempted themselves from paying the taxes. So they could grow all the tobacco they wanted, and they never had to deliver any to the crown, right? Further, the ruling authorities in this colony had established a relationship with the Native American population, in which the Native American population were giving them deer hides that they would then ship over and sell, right? And as part of the deal for the deer hides, the governor and his cronies prevented the expansion of white settlement into Native American lands. So what you have is people who are not part of the inner circle are paying taxes, and they're not happy about the tax bite. And then they're prevented from going out and carving out new farms because they're not allowed to expand into Native American territory by order of the governor. So they're feeling that their situation is increasingly becoming more desperate, right? And it's at that point that a nephew of the governor comes to the colony, a man by the name of Bacon. And he's not cut in on the deal with his uncle. And so he decides to see about changing things. And so he gathers up this unrested population who are chafing against these restrictions, and he taps into their anger, and it provokes a rebellion against the royal authorities, right? And so conflict has broken out in the colony. Well, this is a royal colony, and the crown's not going to put up with conflict. So eventually, the crown recognizes or realizes they're not getting any tax revenue from the colony, so they send over the British Royal Marines, who are going to put down this disorder in the colony. Bacon, by the way, has died, but the rebellion lives on, and it's a type of class rebellion. You have the commoners who feel put upon, rebelling against the ruling authority, right? And then the Royal Marines show up and they put down this conflict. But then they investigate what's going on, right, under royal authority. And they find out that the royal governor and his inner circle have been abusing the system for their own benefits. They're sending money back to the crown, but they're exempting themselves from paying taxes. And they've cut this deal with the Native American populations to prevent further expansion of the colony into Native American lands, right? It doesn't happen overnight, but this really is where the process leads to that creates a shared identity amongst the English colonists that is separate than the Native Americans. It's the creation of a white identity, because the deal that's imposed is that the governor and his cronies are removed, the taxes are lessened, but they also say that the colonists can expand. And so there's sort of this tacit deal that your identity as fellow Englishmen, eventually to become the identity of being British, is bound up with you are separate than Native Americans, right? And so the governor had been dealing with the Native American population to the detriment of his fellow Englishmen, right? Because he viewed the Englishmen as lesser sorts because they were the common people. But now we have the creation of a shared white identity that says the interests of this white population, what eventually becomes a British population in concept, means that your shared identity elevates you above Native Americans. And so to cut a deal with the Native Americans where preventing your expansion is something that the governor wouldn't do. This concept of a shared white identity, right? So let's think back to the treatment of the thief in the Jamestown colony who's punished in such a horrendous fashion, right? In 1607, when that occurs, a white commoner could get that treatment, right? Because he was seen as a lesser order. And how do you keep the lesser orders in line? Well, you have to use the fear of punishment, right? So that type of treatment you can see being meted out in 1607. In 1707, you would not see that type of punishment to a white man or a fellow Englishman or a fellow British person, right? That's not to say they didn't have capital punishment. They would, but they wouldn't use that sort of terrorizing step. You would, however, see that type of punishment meted out to an African slave, because then it becomes a system of intimidation for people you consider lesser. No longer the common people right? But African slaves who are seen as a force that needs to be terrorized into compliance in the same way that the peasants needed to be terrorized into compliance in the 1600s, right? It's impossible to know exactly when this switch happens, right? It's something that evolves over time, but sometime crystallizing around a movement that was crystallizing around Bacon's rebellion and continuing in that period afterward is this notion of a shared white identity that's forged out of these notions of various inferior folks, Africans or Native Americans, right? And that's the creation of race. And that is what evolves in this system, right? It didn't start out that they viewed Africans as inherently only suited for labor, because anybody could end up as a slave, right? And it wasn't only that, you know, Africans were seen as people that need to be terrorized. They viewed their own common people as people that needed to be terrorized to keep them in order. What happens over time is the common people are brought into this idea of a shared white identity, which is inherently superior. And so for the English, you know, this system is copied from the Iberians, right? Or it's modeled on the policies that were already going on by the time the English get there. But this is something that evolves out of it. And there's particular English components that are unique to them, right? But this concept of a identity of race, and I'll give you one more thing before we leave this race discussion, is that one of the markers you can see is how things are codified in law, right? So we know that 1619 is the first time in the English colonies that African slaves appear, right? So that's dated as the birth of slavery in the United States, African slavery, because there were attempts to coerce Native American populations before, but this formalized involvement in the Atlantic slave trade system in North America, in the English colonies, is pointed to 1619, because that's the first mention we have of it. But that 1619 mention is, it needs a little further distillation, right? The Virginia colonies were not a regular part of this in the early Virginia colonies, a regular part of the slave trade, because slaves were very expensive, and tobacco in 1619 wasn't very lucrative yet. It was beginning to become lucrative. And so the reason that the captain brought slaves for sale to Virginia is because they didn't sell in the Caribbean. And so you can't take them back, right? And if you're in a market that nobody will buy your wares because there's either too many slaves were delivered at that time, or there was maybe something about this particular batch of slaves that wouldn't sell, maybe they were seen as rebellious or whatever. For whatever reason, this cargo, the captain could not sell. So he tried to find another market. And so he came to the Virginia colonies and sold some of his African slaves and found buyers, right? But the buyers noted how expensive the slaves were, and they would like to buy more, but they simply couldn't afford it. They also had the system of labor production of indentured servants, right? In the Virginia colonies and the Carolina colonies, it's a little unclear the status of the slaves, because in some places slavery is lifelong, but in other places you can see slaves who acquire their own freedom, right? They buy their way out, or sometimes they're treated like it's a penal indenturitude where they have a 14-year term and then they're freed at the end of it. So it's a little murky in the 17th century, the status of African slaves. There's not a lot of them in the Virginia and Carolina colonies, although their numbers are beginning to increase because the indentured servitude business is drying up and because it's becoming more lucrative. So you can afford to purchase these expensive African slaves and still continue to be profitable, right? So that process is changing, but it's still not clearly codified. But by 1700, you're beginning to see things in laws that tell us that Africans are seen as a different status, that African slaves are locked into a different status than everybody else in the colony, right? And I'll give you an example. It became, at 1701, it became illegal for a person to marry a slave, right? So that suggests that they're seen as a separate category in the eyes of the law. Can't marry a slave. But at the same time, it was not illegal to rape a slave. So that stuff that ends up being codified tells us that in the eyes of the law, African slaves are put into a different category. That tells us something about this creation of a white identity and an African identity and a Native American identity that Chaplin argues is a function of this process of the Atlantic slave trade that creates that. All right, any questions about race? All right, now I want to skip to chapter, 11. Christopher Brown's article on the politics of slavery. And so here I want us to be thinking about our previous discussion about Klein, right? So Abby, how does Klein say that slavery ends? Abby, if you're trying to talk to us, you're still muted. Go ahead.
Sorry, when it was abolished.
How did that come to be?
Through the abolitionist movement.
Yeah, how did it come to be? What motivated it, according to Klein?
I'm not sure.
Ryan, do you remember why Klein said the abolitionist movement was motivated? What motivated it?
No.
Cynthia, do you remember what Klein had to say about how the abolitionist movement came to end slavery?
No.
Okay. Klein called it the first mass peaceful movement in history. That this was an attempt by not from the top down, right? It wasn't that the parliament decreed that slavery was going to be ended and everybody else went along with it. It was the people who motivated their parliamentary members to end slavery, right? Klein says it's a two-stage process. First, the intellectual underpinnings of slavery are demolished by enlightenment, right? Because the idea that Africans are an inferior species who are only fitted for slavery is undermined by the fact that Africans are humans just like the rest of us, right? And so there's no intellectual argument to support this idea that Africans should be enslaved. So that has some value, but the larger value is that it becomes bound up with a moral belief that slavery is immoral. And so abolitionists are motivated by the concept of slavery being immoral, and they pressure the crown to get out of the business. Now, it's not solely about this pressure. There's other factors involved, but Klein says a big part of the deciding weight is this mass, peaceful political movement that pressures the crown in England, or in Britain, excuse me, and also puts pressure on the government here in the United States, right? So a moral belief, abolitionists want to abolish it, right? Christopher Brown wants to put this business of slavery and its eradication in sort of a larger component. And what Brown is arguing is that there hasn't been enough discussion about the politics of slavery in the British Empire. And he says there are 5 political aspects of slavery that he thinks needs to be discussed. He says slavery produced political power. That's 1. 2, slavery defined political interest. 3, slavery generated political conflict. 4, slavery shaped political thought. And 5, slavery influenced political cultures. And he says these are 5 elements of slavery that can be understood in political attributes and disputes and debates and alliances within this concept, right? And so what you end up with is groups of people in the British Atlantic world who come in conflict. They have different goals. They have different needs. They have different wants. And what happens is an alliance is formed between different political groups that leads to the abolition of slavery, so says Brown, right? So some of the folks we're talking about, he wants to talk about the planter class, right? Brian, who are the planter class again? Cynthia, you want to take a run on it?
I don't remember.
Who are the planters? Let's just work our way through it. We're talking about plantations, right? So who are the planters? There's really only 2 choices here.
Would have been the people made rich through the agriculture, but through
Okay.
use of slaves.
They're the ownership class. The people who own the plantations are called the planter class, right? The people who do the work, it may sound like they should be called the planters, but they're not. They're the people who do the work. They're the slaves or the overseers in other contexts. But the planters are the wealthy plantation owning individuals, the planter class, right? Now, the dream of every planter who owns a plantation in the Caribbean is to be the following: an absentee plantation owner, right? Because owning the plantations in the colonies is great. You know, you're getting a lot of money growing this sugar, but it's hot. And it turns out there's mosquitoes and, you know, there's, it's difficult to find luxuries to spend your money on, right? They have to bring the luxuries to you. It's much more enjoyable to be fabulously wealthy in London with the money you make in your sugar colony in Barbados, right? And so what you have is the creation of a class of folks who live in the metropole in London, who are part of Parliament because of their wealth, and they're known as the West Indian men. These are plantation owners who own especially sugar plantations in the colonies and are making fantastic sums of money for which they spend and live in London. They acquire mansions and based upon their plantation wealth, they buy into the aristocratic class by buying titles. Maybe their sons or daughters are married into the aristocratic class. And so they're establishing themselves in London based upon their fortunes they make as plantation owners in the sugar islands, right? So, and sugar is produced through slavery, right? So this is the #1 plantation crop. And so sugar as a commodity has political value, right? Because it generates not only enormous money for the West Indian men, it also generates enormous amounts of money for the state, right? Taxes and duties are paid on it. The crown, as we know from the Navigation Acts, all sugar has to go to the metropole, right, from the British sugar islands. And so that generates wealth that's important to the state. Somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of all state revenue comes from sugar plantations in the century from 1690 to 1790, right? So sugar plays a large role in the interest of the state, right? That's a political interest. The state has an interest in this business of sugar. This money was used so individuals, the West Indian men become wealthy, but the state uses it to expand the empire. They turn around and invest it in the Royal Navy. They use it to fund overseas adventures. They use it to fund other colonial expansion, right? So sugar is producing the coin that is used by the state to expand its empire. Therefore, the state is very responsive to the planter's needs because that's the fatted calf, right? You don't want to kill the fatted calf. Well, no, actually, it's the golden goose. Excuse me, I'm mixing my metaphors. The golden goose. Sugar plantations are generating high rates of wealth for the state, which is used to expand the state and make it more powerful, right? How are these sugar plantations running? On enslaved African labor, right? So protecting this business, these sugar islands are enormously lucrative, and so they serve as something that maybe other empires might like to capture, right? If they can take that sugar island, then that wealth will go to the French Empire or the Dutch Empire or the Portuguese Empire, as opposed to the British Empire. So the state's very responsive to the planter's needs. Therefore, the state becomes enmeshed in protecting the Atlantic slave trade. The plantations run on a constant infusion of enslaved Africans, right? The work is murderous. Their slavery forces are treated harshly. And so they need constant replenishment with new slaves. In order to ensure this continues to work, the state becomes part and parcel of this business of slave production, right? So the state is enmeshed in this, including helping to put down slave rebellions, which they put down in very brutal fashion. Remember, I referenced that sugar islands adopt a ratio of 10-to-1 of those who are enslaved and the white population, right? The white population is justifiably terrified of their slave population, right? And so when there is an uprising or a rebellion, the white population, out of their own panic and terror, react in enormously violent fashion to terrorize the remaining slaves, to demonstrate this is what happens if you try and rise up against this system. They rely to some degree upon British forces, the state's forces, to do this as well, right? Slave owners and the state have a common interest or a common antagonist, the slaves themselves, right? And so they pushed, the slave owners pushed the idea, the concept, the perception of Africans as inferiors who are only suited for labor, right? To justify their enslaved status and also the harsh treatment that they received when they got out of line. This helped to propel the concept of racism, in which the state is itself involved in this. All right, we'll stop there. Next Monday, we will finish up this chapter on the politics of slavery and its abolishment, and then we'll talk about the last two articles, which is about how to view the Atlantic world. One method, growing up, viewing the Atlantic world in one fashion, another one, viewing the Atlantic world from a top-down fashion, right? So we'll finish up with that, and then I'll also set up some of the background for the film. Somewhere between here and next couple days, I'll send out the questions for the exam, and then a week from Wednesday, we'll have a review session, all right? I'll see you guys all in a week.